Hey, thank you for tuning into Chrontendo, and guess what? It's another special anniversary episode. It's episode 20 of Chrontendo. How are we going to celebrate? Well, there is a little bit of bonus content to this episode, I suppose. We're kicking off a semi-regular feature here on Chrontendo. But aside from that, it looks like to be a pretty good episode. We got a lot of big names going on this time. Nintendo, Konami, Square, Rare, Jaleco, Irem, SNK, the whole bunch. Even, oddly enough, a port of a Sega game. So let's start off with our really big game this episode. Everyone loves a good story, right? The story behind this game is probably one of the most widely distributed among the video game community online. If you're watching this, you probably already know it. Yume Kojo, Doki Doki Panic, a very curious release. It's the big game this episode, and while being developed by Nintendo, it was published by Fuji Television. First thing to note, I guess this is what you would call a Konami-style intro here. This tells the events leading up to the game. Nintendo hadn't really done this before, tending to prefer simple text scrolls for their intros. Now here's the main novelty of the game. You choose among 4 different characters, each with slightly different character stats. Yume Kojo, or Dream Factory, was a multimedia exposition staged by Fuji Television in July of 1987. Fuji and Nintendo collaborated to release a game based on the Expo's mascots. This would have undoubtedly been good publicity for both Nintendo and Fuji. However, this is not just any Nintendo game. Nope, this reunited what you might call the Nintendo Dream Team. Shigeru Miyamoto, Takashi Tezuka, and Koji Kondo. Their previous 2 games together were Legend of Zelda and Super Mario Bros. Really, not a bad resume. The resulting game was much closer to Mario than Zelda, being a side-scrolling platformer with enemies very similar to Super Mario Bros. The little POW thing is taken directly from the original Mario Bros. Game. However, taken from Zelda was the ability to take multiple hits and even increase your life bar by finding hidden hearts. Note the extremely crazy waterfall in the background. So fast as to possibly cause, some kind of epileptic seizure or something if you're not careful. Now, the novel gameplay mechanic introduced in Doki Doki Panic is that you attack enemies by throwing things at them, your main source of ammo being the plentiful root vegetables growing everywhere. Now, according to the official and frequently repeated Nintendo mythology, every game Miyamoto produces is somehow inspired by his personal life. So, Doki Doki Panic was presumably born from his love of gardening, and possibly also his love of exterminating household pests, such as mice and frogs. While Doki Doki does use repeating bosses, it doesn't really do so to the extreme of Mario Bros., as there are several different types. Here's the very first one here. In the US, it's known as Birdo, the somewhat gender-confused creature which rather horrifyingly lays eggs with its mouth. All the bosses in Doki Doki Panic need to be defeated by throwing things at them. However, your techniques will need to change depending on the layout of the boss's room and his movement patterns and so on. In between levels, we're treated to these little slot machine mini-games where you hopefully can get a few lives. Presumably this was based on Miyamoto's compulsive gambling habit. Something else taking seemingly from Zelda was keys. You'll often come across locked doors and need to grab a key. And I suppose there's even a certain amount of backtracking involved here. Here, for example, you have to go up to the top of the room and get the key, grab it, and then go back down and open the locked door. Here is one of the more well-known bosses, Mouser, a bomb-throwing mouse wearing sunglasses. And like Birdo, he is a pattern-based boss. Run up, grab them as he throws them, and then set them down in exactly the right place so he actually gets hit by the explosion. Of course, using bombs to kill a mouse, even a rather large one, does seem a bit like overkill. Now, I'm not one to accuse Nintendo of trying to pad out a game, but there is one curious little feature here, namely that in order to actually complete the game and get, the quote-unquote real ending, you have to play it 4 times. Yep, every time you sort of go on to the next chapter, you get to change your character if you so choose. However, you must complete the game 1 time in full with each character. That is, when you switch characters, basically you go back to where that character left off last. If it's the first time you've played them, you'll be back at the beginning of the game. Since this was, of course, a Famicom System game, you can save your progress. Now, of course, many of you will recognize this game and already know that it was used as the basis for Super Mario Bros. 2 in the United States. There, of course, already had been a Super Mario 2 released in 1986 in Japan. We covered it back in Chrontendo Episode 8. But that was a simply new, more difficult levels of the first Super Mario Bros. In today's terms, it almost seems more like an expansion pack, or maybe even a hack, than a true sequel. For whatever reason, supposedly, Nintendo of America President Howard Lincoln did not like the game. The Japanese Super Mario Bros. 2 was not released until the Super Nintendo era, where it was on the Super Mario Bros. All-Stars game collection as Super Mario Bros. The Lost Levels. Now, for the US version, there's been actually quite a bit of little sort of graphical makeovers and enhancements. For example, the waterfall here goes much more slowly. You'll notice the character sprites are very nice. These are actually probably the best looking Mario Brothers character sprites in any 8-bit game. There was a completely new storyline added, nice little character selection scene, the leaves on the plants sort of blow in the wind a little bit there. The slot machine segments were given a rather deluxe makeover. So now we come to the rather sensitive issue among Mario fans. Is this game good, and is it a quote-unquote real Mario game? Some folks claim not to like Super Mario Bros. 2, but well, they're wrong. They're just flat out wrong, because this is a great game. In fact, it's better than the the so-called real Super Mario Bros. 2. Now, it is a lot different than the first game, but so what? Super Mario Bros. Was nothing like the original Mario Bros. Mario RPG was nothing like the previous Mario games. And while it's true this is not as fantastic as Super Mario Bros. 3, but then again, few games are. And as we know, there is this weird little rule about NES sequels. They tend to be sort of like the black sheep of the family. Think of the second games in these series, Zelda, Final Fantasy, Castlevania. They all went in a weird direction before returning to a more classic style of gameplay for the third entry. And the bottom line, Super Mario Bros. 2 is a good-looking, well-crafted, fun game with an amazing amount of variation in gameplay, especially for a Famicom title of this vintage. We can definitely see a little bit of influence of a Metroid and Kid Icarus here, with the vertical levels added in, not to mention the fact that you occasionally have to do a bit of backtracking. In true Mario Bros. Fashion, there's a lot of little secrets. For example, here, if you jump off the waterfall, land on that little platform and go into this cave, you can get some bonus gold coins. And the fact that you can now choose between 4 characters also adds a bit of gameplay depth. For example, Luigi can jump higher, Princess Peach can sort of hang in the air for a couple seconds, though both can't pull vegetables as fast as Mario can. And this was actually sort of lifted from Super Mario Bros. 2, the Japanese version, where Luigi could jump higher than Mario. Choosing the right character for each level will make for easier going. For example, here, Princess Peach can sort of jump over everybody and avoid all those enemies. Unlike in the first Super Mario Bros., the bosses tend to increase in difficulty. Here, for example, Birdo now shoots fireballs, as well as eggs, and you have very little horizontal room in which to jump and to grab the eggs. Here we can see the Kid Icarus influence, with the vertical levels and the screens that wrap around from left to right. Obtaining a key will also cause Phanto to come to life and chase after you. Super Mario Bros. 2 is probably a bit trickier than the first game, but the fact that extra lives are so easy to come by make it quite possible to finish the game. Much like in Super Mario Bros. 1, you can find very sort of hidden warps to later levels to give you little shortcuts. Now for me, the one issue I have with the handling is when climbing on vines or chains. It's real easy to land on a vine and then immediately fall off. This happened to me years ago when I played it for the first time, and it happened to me again this time. Other super cool elements, occasionally you will reach the next level via a rocket ship which grows out of the ground. This, by the way, is an early example of the often hated ice level. Konami had used these in Goonies 2 and Esper Dream, but here, it's actually very well implemented. You can actually sort of use the ice to your advantage by making enemies slide off ledges. Here's a good example right here. And there, of course, there are, all the various sorts of cool secrets and shortcuts, and just really everything that you would expect from a Mario game. Which raises a question. How exactly did this end up becoming a Mario game? Well, according to, sort of like the standard versions of the story that you hear on the internet all the time, Nintendo of America just sort of grabbed some random game and slapped Mario sprites on it, thus hoodwinking the gullible US gaming public. But, I don't really know if I believe that. For example, who localized the US release? Supposedly it was Miyamoto and company themselves. But what were Nintendo's actual intentions while making this game? I mean, if you think about it, this is a big and certainly rather expensive game from Nintendo's top creative team, one that would not be released in the US with Fuji's TV's characters. I can assume that much like Sega's Wonder Boy, Nintendo owned the game, but Fuji owned the names and the characters only. Obviously, we don't know the details of Nintendo's and Fuji's deal, but clearly Nintendo must have had the option to release it themselves outside of Japan. And apparently Nintendo had the option to re-release it themselves in Japan, I would guess after about a period of 5 years, because this game was released as a Super Mario game almost exactly 5 years after the original release, in July 1992, as Super Mario USA. And I, for one, just cannot believe that while this game was being developed, here we have the same guys who made Super Mario Bros. Making a game that's very similar to Super Mario Bros. That another company would have limited rights to, at least for a little while, that no one was working on this, and said, there isn't a suitable Mario sequel in the US yet, maybe we can kill two birds with one stone, so to speak. I know what you're probably thinking, this isn't anything like Mario Bros. But on the other hand, of all the games that Miyamoto had developed so far, which one does Doki Doki Panic most resemble? How many other games let you jump on enemies without being killed, and have you collecting coins, climbing vines? We know that Miyamoto felt the need to make pretty substantial gameplay changes to the Zelda sequel, and is Zelda 2 really any more similar to the first Zelda than this game is to Super Mario Bros.? And Miyamoto had no problems officially integrating this into the Mario universe. So was this game perhaps developed with Mario in mind, at least at some stage of the development cycle? I guess we really have no way of knowing. But to me, this somehow just sort of feels like a Mario game. Well, anyway, going back to the game itself, and watch out, there are some spoilers ahead, note the kind of Kid Icarus-y influence in that level right here. Now this is one of the great moments in the game. You grab the little crystal orb to go on to the next level, and then when you go through the Hawk's Mouth, like you've been doing over and over again, it comes to life and starts attacking you. This is almost like a Metal Gear, sort of purposely messing with the gamer's expectations. This is really one of the great moments in video games. And the final boss is actually very cool. He's like this giant toad that you have to destroy using vegetables. Zelda fans might recognize him from his cameo appearance in Link's Awakening. Well, how successful was Doki Doki Panic? I'm really not sure, but Super Mario Bros. Sold quite well here, as presumably did Super Mario USA in Japan. Nintendo re-released the game again as Super Mario Advance for the Game Boy Advance. Now, once again, some people just don't like this game, or feel it's not a real Mario game. I personally think that criticism is a little misguided. Hell, we can just say it's the spiritual sequel to Super Mario Bros., kind of like BioShock. Super Mario Bros. 2 is an improvement over Doki Doki Panic. Both are exceptionally playable games, however. Better than about 99% of the Famicom releases so far. Now, the ending is a little odd. The whole thing was a dream, but it started out with Mario dreaming and waking up. So was he dreaming that he was dreaming? maybe all the Mario games are dreams, and that reality is just a regular plumber living in Brooklyn. It is sort of weird that Princess Peach would like to be hanging out with skilled laborers as much as she does. Well, this was this episode's big game, so now let's move on to the rest. It's Hector 87, another shooter from Hudson Soft, who were of course the same guys who gave us Star Soldier, one of the best shoot-'em-ups we've seen for the Famicom so far, and would later go on to create Super Star Soldier, Final Soldier, and so on. So I was quite looking forward to Hector 87. That was Starship Hector in the US. Oh, by the way, did you notice on the start screen there were the two high score modes, 2 and 5 minutes? We'll discuss that in a little bit. So, like I said, I was really looking forward to this game, hoping it would sort of continue on in the same directions their shoot-'em-ups were going with Star Soldier, but Hector 87 is definitely not the sort of game I was expecting. It seems to draw inspiration from Xevious, with its separate bomb and laser controls. Ground enemies can only be damaged by bombs. And Hector also reminds me a lot of Compile's Zanuck, especially the bosses, where you need to shoot out a series of gun ports in order to destroy it. All this sounds fine, but the cool things about Star Soldier were the power-ups and the various destructible elements found that you could shoot for points. Hector has none of that. That's right, this game has no power-ups. You're stuck with a pea shooter the entire time. In the post-Gradius era of shooters, this seems a little weird. I suppose Hector 87 was sort of going like a retro feel here. Even in 1987, I assumed that some gamers were getting a little bit nostalgic for the good old days of shoot-'em-ups. Incidentally, at this time, Hudson was holding a yearly festival of shoot-'em-up competitions called the Caravan Festival. Hector 87 was this year's entry. Later years would feature the other Star Soldier games, as well as Blazing Lasers. These were point-based competitions, hence the 2 and 5 minute modes in this game, so you could practice racking up points as quickly as possible. But getting a lot of points in Hector is hard because killing enemies is so hard. A lot of enemies take multiple hits. These things come flying right at you, you start firing away, and then they fly off unharmed. Or worse, they just slam right into you. Oddly enough, the boss battles are much easier than the rest of the levels. Well, this brings me to another issue I have with the game, is that it's simply too damn hard. This makes Zanuck look like a walk in the park. Hell, I did better playing Dodon Patchy the first time than I did with this. I think it's just a matter of too many enemies, and you have just too little firepower. Hector is actually one of the hardest shoot-'em-ups I've ever played. In fact, you just seem sort of like too damn underpowered on this thing. I'm sure Takahashi Meijin is great at this game, but you really need to be able to fire 16 shots a second in order to take some of these enemies out. So while Hector certainly has its fans, for me, after Star Soldier, there's just no turning back. Here's a good example right here. That guy on the ground, he just flies right into you. There's so many enemies in this like that, and if you die, you go all the way back to the beginning of the level. So I guess I say this game is too hard, it's really not enough fun to play, there's really too few rewards for your effort, and there's just too many damn enemies that are too hard to shoot. Wow, all the heavy hitters are sort of packed together in the first half of this episode. With that in mind, we come to Dragon Slayer 4, the Drozzle family, or maybe Drosley family. And it is the first Famicom game from the successful Japanese computer game company, Nihon Falcom, though this was actually published by Namco. But wait, you say, what about Dragon Slayer 1 through 3? Well, it'll be worth taking a minute or two to look at the previous history of the Falcom games. The first Dragon Slayer game was released for the PC-88 way back in November 1984, and is a pioneering Japanese proto-role-playing game. Came out just a little before the original release of Hydlide. We saw the MSX port of this game back when we were discussing the first Dragon Quest game. It's even described as an RPG on the title screen, though it's missing a lot of the defining characteristics of RPGs. It sort of resembles Tower of Druaga, which was released the same year, Or maybe early US roguelite games. You roam around a dungeon collecting objects to slay a dragon. Obviously it's pretty ugly, and not really something you want to try playing nowadays. Now much better looking is Dragon Slayer 2, Xanadu, again released for the PC-88 in October 1985, about the same time as Super Mario Bros., though it was later comported to other computers like the FM77 and the MSX. Unlike Dragon Slayer, you could customize your character, for example by entering these rooms and paying money to increase your stats. Apparently Xanadu was a huge hit in Japan, one of the biggest selling Japanese computer games ever. It's not exactly a very playable game, though a much better sequel was released for the Famicom later in 1987. Unlike Dragon Slayer, this probably could be classified as an action RPG, with its sort of heavy focus on stats and your typical Dungeons & Dragons style setting. Now third, and definitely the most impressive opening sequence, was Dragon Slayer 3, Romancia, released in October 1986, also known as Dragon Slayer Jr. Note the big-eyed anime-style characters and very awesome opening music. If nothing else, Nihon Falcom definitely had some classy presentation. Romancia was a lot like Xanadu, side-scrolling hack and slash with some RPG elements, kind of like Chesterfield, another game we'll see later this episode. It was also ported to the Famicom a little later in 1987. Later titles in the Dragon Slayer series were Caesarion, Legend of Heroes, and Lord Monarch. Falcom would of course go on to create the E series, which had a very similar battle mechanic. Basically to stick out your sword and ram the enemies. So while Falcom had found quite a bit of success making games for Japanese computers, apparently by 1987 they must have seen which way the wind was blowing, and they took Dragon Slayer 4 directly to the Famicom, though it also got an MSX release. Incredibly, it was also released in the US by Broderbund as Legacy of the Wizard, with a much cheaper looking title screen. This of course is the US version that we're playing here. Dragon Slayer 4 is similar to the earlier games, but with a twist. You can select which family member you want to take into the dungeon. Each has different attributes and abilities. You then equip them with various objects you picked up. You've seen the equipment selection screen just a moment ago. Though some accessories can only be used by certain family members. I've started off with the father, Zam, and once you come back to the house you can then save and change characters. The object is to descend into the dungeon. The entrance is rather conveniently located right next door to your house. And then to collect 4 crowns and defeat the final boss. And of course also to find the various objects necessary to do this. For example, the magic glove allows you to be able to move certain blocks. This is required to get past certain rooms. At this point the game starts sort of resembling a giant Sokoban puzzle game. You come across the various sorts of treasure chests. When you kill enemies they'll drop things, for example health refills, magic refills, keys which are very important as you'll come across various locked doors throughout the game, gold, all those little gauges up there will tell you how much you have as well as which items you have equipped. Oh, here is a scene of moving the blocks around with the magic glove. Kind of a tricky little mechanic. Now, the thing to understand about Dragon Slayer 4 is just how big and difficult it is. This dungeon has a total of 16 screens by 16 screens, and virtually every single one is filled with multiple exits, puzzles, dead ends, hidden doors, breakable walls, etc. It is one enormous and incredibly complicated maze. You can't just walk from one end to the other. I finally managed to get up into this area, but then it looks like I've actually reached a dead end. And that could be... or... I found the secret exit right there. Inside that little treasure chest is actually the pointy shoes, or the spiked shoes, which allow you to jump on enemies, and I got a loaf of bread there as well. And of course there are respawning monsters on every screen. If you go around like changing blocks, next time you go back to the room everything will be back the way it was originally. Now here I'm playing Pochi, the family pet. Monsters will not attack him, and you need to use monsters to actually get past certain areas. Here's the thing, certain areas can only be accessed by certain characters, sometimes by only using certain items, and maybe those items are only found in areas accessible by certain other characters. So the only way to really get through the game is by lots and lots of trial and error and endless exploration. Neither the manual nor the game itself gives you even the slightest hint about how to get through the game or what to do. Here of course is the requisite inn. There's also shops found in this dungeon as well. So while Dragon Slayer 4 sounds like a cool game, it is in fact impossible to make any sort of progress. The dungeon is so large and difficult to navigate. The player will really never have any idea exactly where you are or what you're supposed to be doing. With games like Deep Dungeon, you could draw your own map, but here, forget about it. This place is way too big and complicated. Nowadays you can find maps online, but even then it's not exactly easy to avoid getting lost. Alright, so I found one of the crowns here with Pochi. This will teleport me to the boss, which is sort of a giant red tick, I suppose. Keep in mind that the controls, and I guess the combat, is not really user-friendly. It's a common complaint in Falcom games. Now honestly, how anyone has ever finished this game is completely beyond my comprehension. I mean, you can go online, you can find a walkthrough, but even then, it's still going to be pretty difficult. And while I do like exploration-based games like Zelda and Metroid and love all the secrets and hidden things in the Mario games, it gives them replay value, Falcom is really taking it too far. They really seem intent on punishing the player, and I get the feeling that Falcom was thinking, oh, Zelda was easy? Well then try this. Really, Falcom kind of come across as sort of jerks for making this game. Aw, look at that cute panda. Hey, you think, you know what would be really neat? An Arkanoid clone with a Mahjong theme. Well then, Jongbou is the game for you. Yep, this is a home version of the arcade game Mahjong Block Jongbou, which also came out in 1987, courtesy of SNK. Remember back before they made tons of fighting games, they put out typical arcade stuff, such as Ikari Warriors and Athena. And they also created games especially for the Japanese market, like this one. And for your amusement, SNK also threw in some cute anime-style girls. The arcade game uses a rotary dial, but unlike Taito, SNK didn't put any special controllers for the home version. This means that Jongbou is controlled by the D-pad, and just like any other breakout-style game that doesn't use a paddle, you tend to sacrifice a bit of speed and control. Still, the game does play reasonably well. Now the object is either to clear the screen or obtain Mahjong. Hitting the tiles will cause the Mahjong tiles to drop, and then catching them will allow you to add them to your row. There's also a couple of power-ups, which I just missed there. And once you've caught a tile, the game will pause while you select the piece to discard. Except, of course, if that last piece just happens to complete your hand. Other than that, it's pretty clear how this game works. Nothing too surprising here. As far as Arkanoid clones go, Jongbou seems pretty basic. I didn't really encounter tons of power-ups or that sort of thing. There's nothing that allows you to shoot lasers or anything like that. Tiles don't look nearly as clean as they do on the arcade version, but they are still largely legible. Oh, I think I'm getting there. The last one I needed. Should you actually complete your row, as I just managed to do somehow, you'll rack up some points and then move on to the next level. For some reason, Jongbou seems to have loading times, which on a cartridge game is pretty odd. Last time I saw that problem was with Super Monkey Daiboken. Here I find one of the relatively scarce power-ups. It creates like a force field that causes the ball to move slowly and then straight down after it passes through. This is quite helpful, but it does make the game a bit more slower and boring than it should be. Fantasy Zone, a game you may have heard of. In fact, if you've been following along with Chrontendo, you'll definitely remember me gushing over this game in Sega Episode 1. That's right, not sure why or how, but this is a Sega game on the Famicom. Originally an arcade game, this version right here, from 1986, Fantasy Zone was a very early entry in what we now call the Q-em-up genre. It was ported to the Master System, seen here, also in 1986, and this was a pretty decent looking port and very playable. I liked the Master System version quite a bit when I covered it in Sega. Now first of all, let me point out this is not the same version of Fantasy Zone that was released in the United States for the NES. That one was by Tengen, and this one is by Sunsoft. Yep, Sunsoft, those weirdos. You know, I've bitched about Sunsoft before, namely the utter lack of anything resembling consistency in their releases. You really never know what to expect with Sunsoft, and Fantasy Zone is a bit of a surprise. Just a little refresher, you fly around blowing up the larger bases, while being harried by smaller enemies and collecting coins. Once you've blown up all the bases, you'll face a boss, and you can also spend the money in the shop to buy power-ups. We saw the shop there just a second ago. However, most of the weapons-based power-ups are strictly temporary. Here's the first boss here. Giant log shooting, I assume those are seeds at you. Most of the weapons power-ups only last around 15 seconds or so, though the speed-up power-ups are permanent, and a lot of the bomb power-ups only have you basically have to buy them one bomb at a time. For example, here is the completely awesome spread shot, or 7-way shot. Very short-lived, but you can completely wipe out almost an entire level using this thing if you hurry enough. Oh yeah, and almost all the bosses are enormous and pretty awesome. Some of the best shooter bosses seen so far, quite whimsical. One cool thing about this version, missing from the SMS version, is the vertical scrolling. In the arcade version, the screen would sort of scroll up or down a bit as you reach the top or bottom. That was jettisoned for the SMS, but actually implemented here. And of course, there's sort of the heavy bomb, or the 16-ton bomb, which is kind of cool. Looks like it's taken right out of Monty Python or something like that. Will kill any enemy other than a boss with, one shot. The Master System couldn't quite capture the original's cotton candy colors and cutesy graphics, but did a decent job. Obviously the Famicom isn't quite up to the task either, but it still looks pretty darn good. I'm still at an utter loss as to how Sunsoft may have acquired the rights for this to be released for the Famicom, or why Sega wanted this released on the Famicom, but nonetheless, here it is. You know, I like this intro. In fact, I think I like it better than the whole rest of the game. For you Kusoge fans, well, here's your supply this episode. Batsu Terii, aka Batsu and Terii. Only thing about this intro is I don't see what it has to do with this game at all. Well, let me tell you, this is one really funky game. Not surprisingly, it turns out it's based on a manga from one Yasuichi Oshima. It concerns, well, baseball and motorcycle gangs. Not to mention a guy who wears his pants way too high. Hence the name Bats. Not so sure about Terii. And of course, a movie had also been released in 1987. So, what exactly is this game about? Well, I don't know. Apparently, Batsu Terii are escaping from a prison camp or something. Or rather, they're racing. I don't know. Makyo no Tetsujin Race is the subtitle. Makyo means Devil World. And these guys are apparently, well, I don't know, they're going through a race through hell or something. Oh, by the way, this is Terii. He throws baseballs. Oh, and I love the fact that when you shoot someone and then continue to move, the little explosion will move with your character, as opposed to staying put. That's some really great programming here. And Batsu Terii live in like the industrial area of Mario World or something. Oddly, some of the enemies seem completely invulnerable to your baseballs. What's going on here? There's like trees growing out of the sky? I mean, really nothing in this game seems to make any sense whatsoever. It was a pretty short level we had there. Well, anyway, Eventually, through going through all these various kinds of shenanigans, here we are at that same hut again, we will eventually enter into some sort of sewer system, or dim base, as they call it. One thing about Batsu Terii, that's one really ugly color scheme. This is definitely one of the ickiest looking games I've seen for a while for the system. Oh yeah, and apparently there are cars driving around in the sewers? I mean, it doesn't really make much sense. And what exactly is that guy doing? I mean, shouldn't there really be I don't know, rats or giant frogs or something in this level? Here's the final level of the first part of the game. I assume these caves are the Devil World section that was promised in the title. There's a boss coming up here. Ah, so it's a dragon. Hey, what just happened? I killed the boss by running into him? That must be the lamest boss ever. I mean, well, next time you're playing a game and have a hard time with a boss, maybe give that a try. You never know, it might work. Yeah, so this is one just really awful game. From these stupid enemies that you can actually completely avoid half the time, to the horrible level design that require a lot of completely pointless jumping, this game is really a complete failure. Here's our obligatory Konami title of this episode, Exciting Basket for the FDS. Prior to making a fortune with countless variations on Dance Dance Revolution, Konami was well known in the arcade for lots of sports games. Track and Field was enormously popular in the mid-1980s, and another arcade huge hit at this time was 1986's Double Dribble. While this was Konami's second basketball game, the first being 1984's Super Basketball, Double Dribble set the gold standard for arcade hoops. This is the arcade version here. Aside from using lots of human speech samples, it also had these super cool full-motion cutscenes. Naturally, a home port was inevitable. You start this by choosing your time, team, there's 4 teams, clearly based on the Lakers, Bulls, Knicks, and Celtics, and the difficulty level. On the FDS, this was rebranded as part of the Exciting Sports series, and Exciting Basket does bring a lot more pixelated excitement than last episode's Exciting Billiards. Now just recently, we saw Sega's Great Basketball in Chrontendo Episode 3, which was the first 8-bit console basketball game, and that game was pretty awful. Thankfully, Konami avoids all the pitfalls found in Great Basketball. For one, you can actually physically approach another player without getting a foul. You can also steal the ball without fouling. The constant fouls were one of the things that made Sega's game virtually unplayable. Well, you use one button to switch control between the players and to shoot, and the other to pass. Passing is perfectly implemented, as it goes off pretty much without a hitch. Switching players doesn't work quite as well, but I'll discuss that in just a sec. Shooting is again very easy, and 3-point shots can be obtained very easily by shooting from certain spots on the floor. Though for some reason the game calls it a goal whenever you score a basket. One thing that is unique to the FDS version is the nice, rather beefy sounding sound effects as you dribble the ball. One gameplay change, the arcade Double Dribble had 3 buttons. One of them had to be used to actually dribble the ball, that is kind of like in track and field, you had to be constantly pressing the button in order to get your player to dribble the ball and to move. For the console port, this has clearly been dropped, as, well, that would have been pretty damn annoying. Well, obviously, Konami released this in the United States under the arcade name Double Dribble. Note the game logo looks sort of like the official NBA logo in a non-trademark infringing sort of way. You also get the national anthem playing during the intro. Konami released this in the US pretty darn quickly, in September 1987, and really not much has changed. The CPU in the US version seems a little more difficult. It virtually never misses a basket, and its players are pretty evasive when you try to take the ball, and it just moves really fast. After you score a point and the CPU takes control, it will sometimes sort of quickly execute a full court pass and then immediately shoot. In the US, the game is pretty well regarded, and it's certainly not hard to see why. I mean, just look at this. That is pure awesomeness right there. While I guess that might not seem like much nowadays, back in 1987 it was pretty darn impressive. Compare this to something like 10 Yard Fight, which is a pretty good game, but sort of lacks the visual drama of Double Dribble. This game really set a pretty high standard for 8-bit sports games in general. The Atari 7800 also had a basketball game that came out in 1987. It was a port of the computer game One on One, which featured actual basketball players in, but still wasn't nearly as impressive as this. One really important thing about sports games in general is the controls. This game just handles really well. As I mentioned, I had some complaints about the CPU version, but in the 2-player version, these weren't really issues at all, and I think that was sort of the main attraction of the game anyway. And something else Double Dribble had, a really cool little halftime show, in which a confused-looking frog chases after a giant phallic object. Now compare this to the horribly ugly halftime show in the Master System's Great Basketball. Not that I want to harp on the Master System's inferiority to the Famicom or NES here. I do enough of that in Sega, but Sega's game looks pretty feeble next to this. Now I do have one complaint. It actually can be pretty difficult to pick out which player you are currently in control of sometimes. The arcade game gave him like a nice red aura. Here he just sort of slightly flickers. It's a lot more subtle, and it's pretty easy to lose track in the excitement, especially when there are a lot of players all sort of on top of each other and the sprite flicker kicks in. I assume this is mostly due to the Famicom's graphic limitations. There certainly were times when I was trying to switch control of the player that I had, and I couldn't really tell which player I had activated. Still, among basketball video games of the 8-bit era and sports games in general of this period, Double Dribble is really top-notch. So here we are halfway through episode 20, and we now come to Cleopatra no Mahou, or Magical Treasures of Cleopatra, another game published by DOG and developed by Square themselves. As we've seen, Square's early releases haven't exactly been spectacular, and Cleopatra is no exception. But this is notable as being the first RPG, or quasi-RPG, Square developed for the Famicom. Also notable are the fact that in the credits are graphics by Takeshi Takeda, who later directed Chrono Trigger, and music by Nobuo Uematsu. Now, fans of Square should note, this isn't really their first RPG. That would be Cruise Ship Blasty, released in 1986 for the PC-88, which is a surprisingly complicated game, featuring lots of character customization, allowing you multiple actions per turn. This little bit gives it almost sort of like a proto-tactical RPG feel. Unfortunately, it doesn't seem to be very good. You spend a lot of time flying around in space looking for random enemy encounters, and battles are pretty darn long, but the game looks really, really cool. Now, Cleopatra, on the other hand, is much more like a Japanese adventure game with RP battles uncomfortably shoehorned in. It looks very similar to the earlier Suisho no Ryu, with a move, look, take, etc. commands in the menu there. You also have a status command, which shows you your hit points, experience points, and money. Here I'm going to actually buy a weapon. You start off with no weapon, but you can buy the dagger for 100 pieces of gold. What's missing are any other stats, such as like your level, attack, defense, that kind of stuff. In typical old-school fashion, just like the first Deep Dungeon game, gaining more experience will only increase your hit points. Increasing your attack or defense can only be done by buying weapons and armor. And there aren't exactly a whole lot of weapons and armor in this game. And one thing about Cleopatra, it's extremely boring and unbalanced. You start off roaming around town, killing enemies and getting experience and gold. That's pretty typical of RPGs, but the entire town is literally 8 screens. 4 of them are shop fronts, like this one seen here, and the other 4 basically the alleys between the shops. You move just like in Suishu. You select the move option from the menu and point the arrow which direction you want to move, and then hit the button again. This makes moving around a bit slower than in most other RPGs. So you'll spend the first chunk of the game going around in circles over the same 8 screens, fighting battles, going to the inn, and then repeating, trying to get enough gold to buy the map you need to get to the next area. Easier said than done. The inn is expensive, 50 gold pieces as a matter of fact, and the enemies don't exactly drop much gold. And at one point, an enemy stole about half my gold. So it actually took me quite a while before I made much headway. I've entered the inn here. One thing I will say, this game does have some rather ugly character graphics. And I love the fact that they're called cashiers and appear to have what looks like a modern-style cash register. Here's one of the 3 enemies you'll find in this first area. I guess they're kind of nicely animated, but really nothing spectacular. This first part of the game really is incredibly grindy. I mean, it's much worse than, say, the first Dragon Warrior. Mostly because you're just sort of seeing these same little alleyways over and over and over again. Sometimes you might spend a minute or two just sort of wandering around the town in circles looking for an enemy. Now eventually, once you've bought the map, you can head out to the Sphinx, find a hidden door, and then get some standard adventure game sequences. First, you've got to find the hidden door by pointing to it, using your look arrow. There it is. And once inside, of course, you can look at the items, pick them up, try to use them in various ways. It's just sort of the standard, you know, attach item A to item B, so on and so forth. There really only are a couple different screens of this sort of thing. Here, for example, you sort of pick up the various objects, and then later you have to insert the onks into some holes found in a wall. That red jewel you have to put into the missing eye socket of a statue. Really nothing too challenging or exciting here. So once you find this tower, you'll move on to sort of the next few screens of fighting enemies. And unfortunately, there is really not much of a transition in enemy difficulty. The town that you were in earlier has enemies that usually can hit you for up to about 10 points of damage, and in the tower, the enemies will often go up to 80 points of damage. And once again, there are only a few types of enemies in each area. As I think I mentioned, there are about 3 in the town and maybe 4 in this tower, not counting the bosses that you find in the room. And unfortunately, the battles in this are extremely mechanical. There's no magic or items that can be used in battle, and there aren't any, like, virtual dice rolls when it comes to dealing damage. A certain enemy will always do the exact same amount of damage every time it hits you. For example, the scorpions. When they hit you, they will always do exactly that amount of damage right there. Same thing when you hit them, depending on what weapon you have, you'll always do the same amount of damage. Doesn't matter how high you've actually leveled up. And there are boss-like enemies, but defeating them really requires no strategy. It's simply a matter of, is my hit points high enough to withstand 5 hits from the boss if each hit takes 300 damage? So, I did find Cleopatra pretty intriguing, just because it does everything so poorly. I mean, certainly Square helped popularize the console RPG in Japan and in the West, and became known primarily as a publisher of RPGs, yet this game is just so awful. It's really odd to think that this came out only a few months before Final Fantasy. One helpful thing, it does allow you to run from battles, and you'll need to do this frequently if you get low on hit points because, well, the inn is actually in the town. There is a healing room inside the tower, but it's pretty expensive, 250 gold. So often you find yourself sort of going to the tower, fighting a few enemy battles, going back down to the bottom, going to town, healing, going back to the tower, and the loading screens and sort of slow movement make this much more tiresome than it should be. Here's one of the bosses right here. Sort of an Indian-style snake. This game, in theory, has a Egyptian theme, but I'm not so sure about those snakes. So, Cleopatra, I guess the whole kind of adventure game slash RPG was certainly an interesting idea, but all in all, I'd say it definitely does not work. Okay, it's the third FDS game released on July 24th, and it's a weird one. Titanic Mystery, Ao no Senritsu, which rather poetically means Melody of Blue. First of all, just look at how much this intro looks like that of the Sega Master System's Rocky, which we saw back in Chrontendo Episode 3. So this is a rather unusual strategy adventure game, and it is actually a port of a Commodore 64 release, originally developed by a little company called Oxford Digital Enterprises. I think they are British. The game was released by Activision. This is the old version here. You may have noticed their copyright on the title screen. It was released as Raise the Titanic around 1986. Electric Dreams, a publisher that put out a lot of Activision's titles in Europe, was apparently going to release it over there under the title RMS Titanic, but I guess the release was cancelled. Well, the object is to raise the Titanic. Most of the game takes place in the control room using a little sort of remote-controlled robotic drone to explore the ship. Pretty cool graphics. They're sort of like a neat night vision effect on the monitor while you're exploring the interior of the Titanic. Also, you need to keep track of your money, deal with financiers, and even hold press conferences concerning the mission. This right here is the room where you talk with various bankers. Now, how exactly this ended up getting turned into a Famicom game is anyone's guess. Since this is a Japanese game, of course, some sex appeal is added. You now control a perpetually swimsuit and headband-clad young lady. She looks more like an aerobic instructor than a scuba diver, and you spend a lot of time looking at her oddly shaped hindquarters. There are actually 2 games this episode which focus a lot on ass shots for some reason. The graphics now look a lot more Nintendo-y, and you now sort of control your character directly by entering rooms rather than simply navigating menus. The publisher, by the way, was Gakken, a huge Japanese educational publisher. They do tons of magazines and textbooks and so on. You may recall we've seen a few other print publishers like Tacoma Shoten start releasing Famicom games. Gakken briefly got into the video game racket, but I don't think they really released much of interest. Oh, here's the press conference sections here. It's interesting, a lot of the US video games, or rather US computer games at this time, like the various strategy type games and so on, didn't really have you controlling an on-screen representation of your character. In Japan, in both arcade and console games, it seemed much more important to have a visible sprite, be it like a spaceship or a person or whatever, to sort of represent the player. The Portopia-style adventure games was one exception. So in Titanic Mystery, you now control the diver directly, and can explore the ship in like the more standard, Famicom video game style fashion. So this is an interesting little historical oddity, one that seems to have fallen through the cracks, like a few games this episode. As I'm sure you figured out from the cover art a second ago, this is a karaoke game. Awesome. Can't believe it took 4 years for someone to come out with a karaoke game for the Famicom. I mean, there's a built-in microphone on the controller. Although Karaoke Studio comes with a special microphone attachment. Okay, so you plug in, select your song, and then start singing. And cute little animations play during the songs, some of which are quite charming. Though, not really this one. The songs are mostly standard issue kiddie stuff. I don't think there are any licensed pop songs on this thing. The developer is that old Bandai standby, Tosei, and I guess they do a pretty good job here. One of the rather cute ones is where the police officer dog leads around the lost kitten. I guess that we would not, strictly speaking, call this a game. I guess it's more like a toy. You might find it a bit amusing, I suppose. Remember, of course, that karaoke is and was still very popular in Japan. One of the options is where you can actually sing before a crowd, and this is great. You're accompanied by just one guy who's playing the tubular bells. There's another option where you sort of sing before some kind of a panel of talent judges or something like that. So, Karaoke Studio isn't exactly a candidate for something that you want to play, but it is worth noting that Bandai is becoming an early advocate of what we might call casual gaming. What with their family trainer games and stuff like this, these weren't really aimed at a gamer audience. Instead, they were aimed at sort of, regular folks who might not normally play video games. I guess, when you think about it, the Nintendo of today, really owes them a pretty big conceptual debt for this kind of stuff. Oh, and Bandai did release a couple add-ons to this. These are just carts that contain more songs. One will come out later in the year, and then one will come out in early 1988. Sandwiched between two Bandai games is Victokai's Chesterfield. For those who don't recall, Victokai is an enormous Japanese cable and telecom company. Started making video games in the mid-1980s. This is their second Famicom game, the first being 1986's Aijina no Yogen. Now, I will admit, with a name like Chesterfield, I assumed this was going to be some sort of detective adventure game, featuring some Raymond Chandler-esque hard-boiled, chain-smoking detective. But nope, just like Aijina no Yogen, it's a fantasy-themed action game. I do love that hilariously protracted opening title scroll. In true 1980s video game fashion, it sort of tacks on an overly complicated plot and backstory, introducing all these characters who we have no idea who they are, and none of this really has much bearing on the game itself. So it turns out Chesterfield is not a person, but rather a medieval fantasy island that this game takes place on. Does this look sort of familiar? Oh yeah, last episode this was called Zombie Hunter. Well, this is perhaps a bit better than Zombie Hunter. Now, definitely this game doesn't pull any punches. Right away it sort of puts you into the first dungeon, which we saw there a moment ago, but it's maybe better not to tackle that dungeon right away. So this is back in a time when video game genres maybe weren't quite so defined. You might consider this to be a side-scrolling action RPG, or maybe a hack-and-slash platformer with RPG elements, or maybe just a clone of Zelda 2, with the overworld sequences removed. Here, of course, is one of the many shops we find. Oddly, a lot of these sell one item only. And here is the first boss. Looks kind of like the thing from the Alien movies. It's a typical sort of jump up, hit him in the head, and then back away sort of boss. Now, what exactly, may you ask, is the difference between this game and, say, Getsufu Madden? Well, aside from Chesterfield's lack of anything aesthetically pleasing and its extreme linearity, it's the combat. Fighting monsters in Chesterfield, especially bosses, is just not cool. Your character is slow, he jumps funny, and most annoyingly freezes when he takes a hit. If you get hit while jumping, your character will sort of stop in midair for a second, and then continue along the arc of the jump. Boss battles are hard, not due to the bosses being unpredictable or anything, but just because your character is sort of hard to control. When you're fighting regular monsters, they tend to drop, get this, gold or health refills. How original! Kill enough monsters and you eventually level up, and gold can buy things in the shops, or you can go into an inn and restore your health. For some reason, almost all the shops and inns are owned by cute girls. Though, of course, the guys who give you advice are your typical, old bearded dudes. One thing that's a little strange is your character's speed is very eccentric. It seems his general walking speed tends to increase or decrease from time to time. I assume this is a technical glitch of some sort, but it certainly is annoying. Now, Chesterfield has something in common with Square's Cleopatra game. It doesn't really seem to understand the appeals of stats and levels in RPGs. In Dragon Quest, for example, seeing your level go up and being informed of your strength or endurance or whatever increasing triggers some sort of like Pavlovian instinct in gamers to sort of get all excited and feel a sense of accomplishment. Here, while you do technically get stronger and get better weapons, you don't really ever feel a sense of progress. Part of it maybe you can only increase your level so many times in each section of the game. This gives improving your character sort of a predetermined feel to it, rather than something you actually control. I guess I shouldn't be too hard on Chesterfield. It certainly is better than Zombie Hunter, and some people may even give it a certain amount of enjoyment out of it. Alright, it's official. I'm really starting to get tired of Bandai's family trainer games. While we've only had a few Power Pad games in the US, Bandai put out a whole bunch in Japan. Like this one, Miru Daisakusen, which means something like Maze, Great Mission. And damn, there's that stupid dinosaur from the Pocket Zorus game. Most of the previous family trainer releases had some sort of athletic theme. Meiro Daisakusen breaks the mold by putting you in an adventure game set in a 3D labyrinth. I guess there is even some sort of plot involved. So, Family Trainer has moved from its purpose of providing exercise to lazy middle-class brats to simply being a regular video game. Granted, one where you have to walk around on the pad instead of just using your controller. It's not really that great of an idea. There has been a bit of an adjustment made to the standard Family Trainer controller scheme. You now have to turn corners in this game. Earlier games mostly just had you walking or running straight forward. Well, this title certainly isn't very good, and there is however some good news, namely that this being the 5th title in the Family Trainer series, we are now halfway done. It's Monty no Doki Doki Daisassou, or as the title screen also says, Monty on the Run. Another oddball title here, folks, as we shall see in just a moment. Pretty cool music, but observe, a copyright to Graphics, the UK-based computer game company, who released a lot of sort of lousy games. Monty on the Run was one of their biggest hits, originally released for the C64 and a few other computers in 1985. Though the copyright says 1986, so who knows? It's a sequel to 1984's Wanted Monty Mole. This C64 version is known for having some great music by Ron Hubbard, some of the best for the system. It's also known for being insanely hard, mostly due to the terrible pre-Super Mario Bros. Style jumping controls. So Jellico apparently obtained the Japanese rights and released this game. Now first of all, note at the beginning here you have to choose 2 objects to take with you. Among them are weapons and various helpful items. Here's the thing, this has virtually nothing to do with the original game. Obviously, Monty is no longer a mole, he's now a human. And rather than trying to hop a ship to cross the English Channel and escape to the continent, Monty is now, I think, trying to prove he did not commit the crime of which he was committed. This is done by collecting various pieces of a photo of the real criminal, which are scattered throughout the various undergrounds, temples, and caverns and whatnot. And again, let me stress this fact, virtually everything has been changed for the Famicom version. And by that I mean the levels, the enemies, really the entire idea. If you were to play this without knowing what it was called, you would really have no idea that it was supposedly based on Monty on the Run. Now, there are a few things that have been borrowed from the original. For example, your character jumps by doing a little mid-air flip, or the rising and falling columns that you'll need to slip under. I guess the general idea of sort of hopping around from platform to platform. There are a few things taken directly from the game, like the elevators that kill you when you get into them. That's very nice. And also watch out for the teleporters, that'll warp you back to the beginning of the game. Jellicoe, you bastards. Now, while this is not nearly as impossible as the C64 game, it can be a bit cruel. All the items and keys you need to find are hidden, usually in ordinary-looking blocks. Or they just sort of appear, when you enter a certain area. We've seen this in many games before, but while Super Pitfall, for example, it rendered the game virtually unplayable, it's a lot more manageable here. And while the levels have various booby traps and dead ends and whatnot, Monty is really not an exercise in torturing the player the way Dragon Slayer 4 is. Still, some rather unfair curveballs are thrown at you. Here I found the final boss of the first level, but I don't have enough ammo to kill him. The gun only comes with 10 bullets, and refill ammo is pretty scarce. I was actually conserving my ammo, but still, after emptying the gun at him, he still had some health left. So I guess I'm screwed, there's nothing I can do. Well, the secret, you actually have to choose the right items at the beginning of the level, such as the Morning Star, which does not require ammo, and the oxygen tanks, so you don't die while swimming. Of course, you have to choose the items before you know which ones are necessary to complete the level. Without the oxygen, you'll lose like a lot of health crossing the various bodies of water. And with the infinite use of the Morning Star, you can seriously punish that mummy. Here's a good example of one of the water tanks, which will probably kill you if you try it without the oxygen tanks. Now the weird thing is, despite all the various flaws and somewhat funky controls, like the way he sort of spazzes out when he jumps when there's something right above his head, I actually pretty much like this game. It's definitely not in the same league as Metroid, but compared to most other games in the explore caverns and find items while killing monsters genre, such as Super Pitfall or Wing of Medulla or Nazo no Atlantis, this game is actually very respectable. The mystery is why Jellicoe licensed the Monty name and then made an entirely new game. Obviously some changes would need to be made to make the game palatable to console gamers in 1987, but if they were going to start from square one, why bother buying the rights? Before we get into our next game, Slalom, I'd like to introduce a new feature to Chrontendo. Occasionally, we'll take a look at a game developer or publisher in more detail, sort of a mini-company bio. Since Slalom is the first NES game from the British developer Rare, we'll go ahead and take a few minutes and delve into the history of this famous and sometimes infamous company. To begin with, Rare was formed in 1982 by Tim and Chris Stamper in Leicestershire County, smack dab in the middle of England, in a quaint little town of Ashby de la Zouch. Of course, they didn't call themselves Rare back then. Of course not. They named their company Ashby Computers and Graphics, and in the fine British tradition of giving video game companies really awkward names, they released their titles under the name Ultimate Play the Game. At the time, the popular computer in England was Sinclair's ZX Spectrum, a graphical powerhouse. The higher-end model packed a whopping 48K of RAM and could display up to 3 colors on the screen at one time. Okay, we could actually display 7 colors at once. But for various technical reasons, you couldn't really put 2 colors next to each other unless one of those colors was black. Ultimate's first game was 1983's Jetpack, an arcade-style game in which your jetpack-equipped astronaut attempts to assemble the pieces of his rocket ship while under constant attack from alien forces. The game was a huge smash success in the UK, selling almost 1,000 copies. Well, alright, it actually sold around 300,000, so it really was quite a big hit. Ultimate continued to make similar games at the rate of around 6 a year, and all were successful, such as Cookie, also from 1983, where you play a chef trying to land the proper ingredients into your mixing bowl. A Tic Attack was much more ambitious, featuring a multiple-room castle, which you must explore in order to find some sort of golden key. The basic gameplay idea, cruising around interconnected screens looking for objects, I suppose that genre originated with Atari's Adventure from 1979, this basic gameplay idea formed the basis for most of Rare's later Spectrum games. In 1984, that was a banner year for Ultimate, starting with Saberwolf, which started the tradition of misspelled words in their game titles. By this time, English game critics and fans were heaping massive amounts of adulation on the company. The hard-working Stamper brothers reaped substantial fame and fortune as a result. Even more widely praised was Nightlore, which as far as I can tell contains no knights. This was the first Rare game to employ isometric perspective using the Filmation graphics engine. This actually kicked off a brief mania for isometric games in the UK, and caused British gamers to work themselves into an incredible frenzy. Well, nowadays, Nightlore might seem sort of like a rather simple, though decent-looking adventure game with wonky controls. Many ZX fans consider it to be like the Sistine Chapel of video game design. One rather amazing quote I came across on Wikipedia was from the UK game magazine Edge, which called it, quote, the single greatest advance in the history of computer games, end quote. Well, I guess whatever you say. One thing about Rare was they did have quality packaging with very cool illustrations on all their games, sort of like the British equivalent of Electronic Arts. While the games contained no in-game storyline, the packaging usually detailed the plot in Rare's distinctive, though hilariously overwrought style. For example, from the box of Nightlore. Behind me I feel night's dark icy fingers slither up long looming shadows, hiding behind large mounds of boulders, watching my every move, silently waiting. For days I have journeyed from the realms of Jungle Wolf to Nightlore Castle, to seek the old dying wizard, etc., etc. I guess to really appreciate that you sort of have to read that in a Richard Burton style voice. This game is Pentagram from 1985, another title in the Nightlore style. Oddly, the Famicom port of Nightlore, covered in Chrontendo episode 13, more resembles this game than the original Nightlore. Now at this point, the first stage in Rare's career comes to an end. Surprisingly, after a brief attempt at branching out to the Commodore 64, the Stamper Brothers sold the name, Ultimate Play the Game, and stopped making computer games. They decided the future was with console games, and turned their attention towards Nintendo. In 1986, after having studied the inner workings of the Famicom, they created Slalom, the game in question this episode. Nintendo released this game themselves, and from this point onward, the newly named Rare would release games almost exclusively for Nintendo machines. One of their earlier Nintendo Entertainment System hits was RC Pro-Am from 1988. This remote-controlled racing game uses Rare's now beloved isometric perspective. A cool game, but Rare has changed up their business strategy completely. Rather than presenting themselves as a prestige developer, Rare now did quick and dirty work for anyone and everyone. In the late 1980s and early 90s, we saw them turn out tons of ports and awful licensed games for the likes of shipmeisters like LJN, Acclaim, Mattel, and GameTech. The Stampers had gone from being kings of the UK computer game scene to reliable guns for hire for the American console scene. Still, they would occasionally turn out an interesting product, like 1991's Battletoads, which in typical Rare fashion is weird, combining technically impressive stuff with lots of glitchiness. It's also impossibly difficult, to the point where opinions are divided as to whether it's a classic or a barely playable disaster. But all of this changed completely in 1994, when Rareware became a second-party developer for Nintendo and released Donkey Kong Country for the Super Nintendo. Aside from reviving the long-dead Donkey Kong franchise, Rare impressed everyone with its revolutionary graphics, replacing boring old hand-drawn sprites for pre-rendered 3D models. The game was enormously successful, sold tons of copies, and won lots of praise at the time. Nowadays, however, the Donkey Kong Country's luster has faded, and a number of folks consider it to be a pretty lackluster platformer with pretty graphics. Still, Rare now found themselves a very hot commodity, and once again they were a prestige developer, slowly releasing a series of well-crafted, big-name games. Donkey Kong sequels came out in 1995 and 1996. But in 1997, Rare reached the pinnacle of their career with the release of GoldenEye 007 for Nintendo. This Nintendo 64 title helped bring full 3D first-person shooters to consoles, and sold about 8 million copies, outselling even Legend of Zelda: Ocarina of Time, and it remains one of the best-loved video games of all time. GoldenEye manages to be technically impressive and still play exceptionally well, a huge triumph for Rare, and one that would be very difficult to duplicate. but they somehow almost pulled it off with 2000's Perfect Dark, published by Rare themselves. If anything, Perfect Dark was an even better game than GoldenEye, and was also a pretty sizable hit. Rare also developed very popular N64 games like Donkey Kong 64 and the Banjo-Kazooie games. Now, being Nintendo's biggest second-party developer, everyone was rather surprised when, in 2002, Microsoft announced they had purchased Rare for the staggering and record-breaking sum of $375 million. However, at this point, the party was pretty much over. Rare had been slowly losing employees since the release of GoldenEye, and Rare's first game for Microsoft's Xbox console, grabbed by the Ghoulies, was a huge disappointment both in terms of quality and sales. Even worse, Rare's later games for Microsoft really failed to attract much attention. Perfect Dark Zero sold a fraction of its predecessor, and Cameo, originally planned for the GameCube, also failed to find much of a fanbase. Probably Rare's only successful franchise for Xbox is the Viva Pinata series. And in 2007, the Stamper Brothers themselves jumped ship, leaving Microsoft holding a $375 million bag, the suckers. But now let's rewind to October 1987 and Slalom. And with no further ado, here is Slalom, Rare's first NES game. This was not released for the Famicom in Japan. Most of Rare's titles ended up being for the US or European market, which makes sense, I suppose, since they're really more tuned into the wants of the Western audiences. Slalom is obviously a skiing game. Upon loading, you'll find you'll choose your mountain. Snowy Hill is the easiest, Mountain Nasty is the hardest. Each mountain has several courses. Now, before being released for the NES, Slalom hit the arcades, supposedly in November 1986, as Versus Slalom. The Nintendo Versus arcade machines were based on the NES hardware, though the games were often a little different than the home versions. You can see the colors are a little bit off here. The arcade cabinet actually had these silly skis and ski poles built in, so you felt like you were actually skiing. Or maybe not. Anyway, a number of popular NES titles were released for the arcades in the Versus format. If you were to do a side-by-side comparison, you'd see very slight graphical differences between the two versions, but for all intensive purposes, they are virtually indistinguishable. You begin each slope with this qualifying time trial, and then you can move on to the real slopes. There are other skiers, but like a number of racing games of this era, the object isn't so much to beat the competition as it is to cross the finish line before the time runs out. You have to avoid trees, snowmen, other skiers, and the actual slalom markers. You can execute little jumps and stuff, but as you may have seen a moment ago, I didn't actually do any. And in what I suppose is sort of a typical British humor, your character's butt cheeks are very prominently placed and unusually well detailed. So how's the gameplay? Well, Slalom looks great, I'll give it that. Its sprite-based 3D effects are very convincing. The sprites become more detailed as they get closer to you, and everything whizzes by very smoothly. Slalom doesn't really look nearly as spastic as Nintendo's own Mach Rider from 1985, for example. And here we come to the crux of many of Rare's games. Technically, it's very impressive, but in terms of play, Slalom is not so good. With the racing games, you really control the track more than the vehicle itself. In Outrun, for example, the vehicle only tilts very slightly to the left or right, while the road moves beneath you. You have very precise control over the road and where your vehicle is on the road. You can sort of very smoothly follow the outside curve of the road, for example. With Slalom, hitting the D-pad will cause your skier to sort of turn at a 45-degree angle. The control is very imprecise. You are basically going either straight forward, to the right 45 degrees, or to the left 45 degrees. This gives the controls a much more digital feel, rather than a smooth analog feel. You can't really make smooth turns the way you can in most racing games, and the character's motions seem very jerky. So really, Slalom feels like a racing game with very bad controls. I was pretty much constantly fighting the controls on this. Swerving to avoid obstacles and then straightening out to pass between the markers is way clumsier than it should be. I can only assume this was due to technical limitations, with all the obstacles on the path coming towards you, It would make it be much easier to make most of the motion come from the skier, rather than from the background. But I really feel the controls could have been a lot better implemented. So Slalom is a bit of a landmark game, but still not a very good one. Here's our final game this episode. Perhaps a bit of a letdown. You see, this is a Mahjong game from Irem, but licensed from Ox Incorporated? Who the heck are Ox Incorporated? Is this game a port? I couldn't find any arcade version of this. Perhaps some obscure Japanese computer game? I really wish that I knew. I suppose that if anyone has any ideas about this, let me know. I'm not really going to spend too much time on all these Mahjong games. These episodes are long enough as it is, and probably it's best not to focus too heavily on a genre that doesn't really interest very many folks. On a purely superficial level, most of these games look the same. Undoubtedly, Mahjong enthusiasts would pick up on the subtle gameplay variations, and Mahjong has many of those. But for most folks, it will be enough to say that this is a one-on-one version of Mahjong, often found in video games. In real life, Mahjong is played by 4 people, or 3 in one particular variant, but, well, like a lot of gambling games, it gets simplified when converted to video game form. Oddly, the title means Mahjong Family, and Namco released Family Mahjong about 1 week later. We'll see that next episode. For now, let me just leave you with the fact that this is actually sort of the beginning in a whole bunch of Mahjong games coming out for the Famicom. It's going to become a very ubiquitous genre in Japanese video games. Thank you very much for watching Chrontendo episode 20. Well, guess what's going on next time? That's right, more Mahjong games. Okay, actually only one. But what we do have that's cool are the debuts of 2 franchises that some of you discriminating gamers might be familiar with. Also, games from Konami. That's right, 3 big games from Konami. So next episode is virtually like the Konami Blowout episode. So we'll see you then.